Talks of David Solomon, podcasts on topics ranging from Jewish history and the Bible to Jewish mysticism, philosophy and thought. To find out about David's talks, books and more, visit davidsolomon.online. And now, here's the lecture.
When Rabbi Grona asked me a few months ago, and those of you who know me know that my temporal horizon in my own life is about 24 to 48 hours. So I give topics that I'm going to be giving months in advance, and suddenly the time comes and I'm told I'm giving this topic in a week or two, and it kind of, I go, oh, really? And then we dive into it. And for some reason, a few months ago, I thought that the 12th and 13th centuries was a period that really was asking us more questions than we had complete answers for, and I was very much looking forward. I was familiar with the period, that's why I chose it, but I wanted to go into it in some detail to unpack it and why it's important. I know that not everybody in the room tonight is a fan specifically of the 12th and 13th centuries. You're coming to find out what it's all about, as opposed to coming as experts, but I cannot assume anything either that you know or that you don't know. So it could be everything I'm going to talk to you about tonight is like really basic. And that's where I'm going to start. And then I'll see by your faces whether or not I'm wasting your time. I'm not going to do a timeline.
No.
Calm down. Huh? Yeah, I'm going to get some tea. I'm not going to do a timeline because I've got a feeling that it's fairly easy to work out when it is I'm talking about. This 4-part course is going to go over 2 centuries, from 1100 to 1300 in Jewish history. And because it's 4 parts, I thought, what's 200 divided by 4? And so tonight's talk is on 1100 to 1150, approx. Some of you may have heard me say before that the more focused you get on a historical period, the harder it becomes in a way. It's very easy to Uber across the surface, but when we stop and look at the detail, it's hard to contain it. It's hard to know where the scale is at which to look at. So what we want to talk about is get a real understanding of the framework of what's going on in the world, in the Jewish world between 11 and 1100, and as always, therefore, I have to make some prefatory remarks. We will talk about some amazing people and events, but we've got to understand the world that we are talking about. And this is the part that I'm scared is going to be really simplistic and basic. So stay with me. You are all, I can tell by looking at you, it's silly of me to have to remind you of what the world looked like in 1100. But for the sake of those of us who were not there, I will do it very broadly, okay? And you'll tell me if I get it wrong. But basically, here we go.
Make an offer.
All right. Now, it is, of course. Every history talk in Jewish history really has to start with that, either a timeline or that. Now, this is a complicated world. We obviously do not have a lot of time to go into what has brought this world that I'm about to talk about to being. It's a lot of different historical circumstances, but if you woke up in the year 1100, basically this is what the world that you're aware of will look like. But before I show you that, I want to tell you that Jews in 1100 are living everywhere. They're living everywhere. Remember, 1100. So there's no America, there's no Australia, there's a China, which is basically like the moon, but Jews are living there. They're aware of, the Silk Road is a thing that, 1 or 2 people that you might have heard of would do once or twice in a lifetime. It was a real schlep, but it brought an awareness of what was going on outside the world. Africa ended, around about here, about halfway down. And oceanography as we know it and maritime sailing was still in that age where things were kept pretty close to coasts. No one was venturing out even to the Atlantic, let alone, or the Indian, further than, say, 100 miles or so from the coast. Yeah, there was a thing called navigation, but a lot of the world had not yet been explored. We still do not know. No one's ever been round the bottom of Africa. No one's ever travelled further than, say, where the Vikings might live. But there are Jews everywhere. Everywhere where people have been, people from the known world, there are Jews. Now, if, however, you're living in what we call the known world, this is what it would look like. Obviously. I've drawn that big because I've got to talk about it. It's probably a little smaller to scale, you'd be aware of that. Just as I'm doing this big. All right? So here, and of course, Italy, Greece. Now, here, more or less, this here's England. More or less that is an entity that knew of itself and that we call the Holy Roman Empire. No?
No, not this time.
What? No. I'm so glad you shook your head because it keeps me on my toes. But I had to very quickly get inside your mind and work out why you said what you said. No, there's no Roman Empire. This is the Holy Roman Empire. This is the Holy Roman Empire that had been reconstituted in 800 by Charlemagne and was a Christian confederacy of states, most of it in Germany, but also bleeding on over into France where the Franks were. The Franks were also Christian, the Swedes were also Christian, the English were also Christian, and they had a nominal allegiance to the Pope sitting in Rome, who was the temporal ruler, the spiritual ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, and the temporal ruler was the king or emperor, and those were mostly Germans. The Franks were occupying most of what France is today. The Franks were Christian, and they had a kind of an alliance with the Holy Roman Empire. They basically acknowledged that the power of the Christian church in Western Europe was there. The other Christian empire was the Byzantine Empire that was amazingly still going, and based in Constantinople, and that was Christianity of the East. And that basically, it was pretty shrunk by the time of 1100. It wasn't anywhere near its former glory, but it basically occupied Greece and Western Turkey and looked something like that. So here's your Christian world, ladies and gentlemen. It's complicated here. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. So those of you who are sitting there clenching your sphincters going, what about there? I'm going to talk about there in a moment. I just want to make sure I get this right because people at this point of the talk are still listening. And if you go to sleep and you wake up, you want to know where we are. So I need to just take this carefully. Basically everything else, this is still a mess. This whole thing that's going to become Rus and all the rest of it, right there. There's parts of it that are nominally Christian already, the way that Western Europe has gone in the last few hundred years, but it's kind of it's still the wild east over here. But everything else down here that I'll do in this color, that I'll do in blue, well, I should have green, but really, Now, the Islamic world is a very complex place that has, over the last few hundred years, evolved to the point where you have basically the Abbasid Caliphate here, and the Umayyad Caliphate had gone over to Spain quite some time before and set up the Cordovan Caliphate and so on over there, but they are now really ruled by a caliphate called the Almohad Caliphate in Spain. They're here, and the reason I'm doing the line there, I'll explain in a moment. And they got all of North Africa up to about here, and in Egypt is the Fatimid Caliphate. All these caliphates, by the way, all of these caliphates are at war with each other.
Of course.
All of them, no question about that.
It's the spouses.
Right? Whereas in Christian Europe doesn't, it's not like Christian Europe doesn't have a history of nations going to war with each other. It does, but at this particular point, there was kind of like a steady alliance in the name of Christianity. There was a Pax Christiana, if you like, hanging over most of Europe. But the Islamic world was very sectionized into these caliphates and their spheres of influence. And then a fourth big force within the Islamic world that had been arising in the last 100 years or so is the Seljuk Empire, based in Turkey. And this, of course, was a whole new thing, because this wasn't led by a caliph. This was led by a sultan. They took the Turkish model. And so they had a kind of an Islamic nobility that wasn't seen as synonymous with the religious leadership as it was in the caliphates. If you want to understand the caliphates, imagine our world, in which ISIS wins. If it has to ring, that's ridiculous. Please put it on silent. Yeah?
No, yeah.
So the Fatimid Caliphate, for example, is based in Egypt. That's kind of a bit of a way. Except they're like ISIS 1, except that ISIS is a particular manifestation of the worst kind of Islamic rule. A lot of these caliphates might have risen because of ideological purposes. Once they got into power, they were quite chilled. Jews were living in communities right across this part of the world. Yeah? And in fact, not just living, but quite tolerated, and even in some cases quite politically involved. Now, in 1100, a couple of things have just happened. And we have to talk about those couple of things. The first is that in 1100, what do you notice about this picture? What do you notice about this picture? And let's talk about actually the Seljuks weren't just here. And remember that the Seljuks were on the expanse, and that they had in fact captured Jerusalem. You're nothing until you capture Jerusalem. And that's true. And that goes for both sides of this equation. Capturing Jerusalem is seen as being the dominant power then and now. Jerusalem has been, is, and will be effectively the center of the world. Did you say why?
Yes.
Why? Why is another 6 hours of talks? Now, it's a good question, but just hold that. The Seljuk Empire is going, basically sticking its fingers right up into here. So, all this blue stuff is Islamic. Now, what do you notice about that? What are you going to do if you're a Christian? Huh? How are you going to feel about that map?
Yeah, besieged.
You're going to feel excited about it? you're going to go, wait a minute, that's not right. That shouldn't be happening. Not only that, they're coming at us. If, it's only a matter of time. And so, over the course of the last century, of the 11th century, that's the last part of the 1000s, I'm giving a broad schematic now. This has many, 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 many details to it, but many details. But the broad picture is that over the course of those last few decades, before the time that we're about to start talking, and during the time we're talking, Christianity was in the middle of making two fundamental pushes into the Islamic world. And when I say fundamental pushes, I mean not just culturally and economically, but militarily. The first of those pushes is here. Because from the middle of the 11th century, from the middle of the 1000s, we start to see the beginning of what is now called the First Reconquista. That is, the Christian world attempting to regain the Iberian Peninsula, to regain Spain. That period, the end of the 1000s, sees the establishment of all those kingdoms that are going to go on to become great Christian kingdoms in Spain, the House of Castile and Leon. And all of that is happening here as they are making conquests against the Islamic rulers in Spain. Finally, towards the end of the 1000s, they actually even captured Toledo, which is almost in the middle of the country. So from that point on, if we walk in at 1100, Spain is pretty much divided vertically, north and south. South is still Islamic, but on the defense, and the Christian armies are pushing through. But the Almoravid rulers of Spain, southern Spain, are still very strong. The Christians can't push that far. Their resources haven't given them that much, but they have made some serious incursions. Everybody follow? So you can see Spain is in the middle of this struggle. At the same time, because a lot of people forget, and I've said this before when we talked about this era very broadly, that a lot of people, not forget, but they never actually realize that these two things are actually going on at the same time. Because at the same time, at the right at the end of the 1000s, just before the period we're opening with, Christian Europe embarks on a project known as the Crusades. And in 1095, Urban II announced the First Crusade, and off it went. And that is why the Crusades are a background issue that we have to talk about, but they are a background issue for the whole of this series that we're going to be together. Because basically the Crusades go from 1095 to 1290. There are six or seven major crusades, and there are 9 or 12 if you count other minor ones, depending on which historians you're talking to or reading. But most acknowledge there were at least 6 major waves of crusades. The first and the third are the ones that are going to interest us the most, because they have the biggest impact on Jewish history. The First Crusade was a major event in Jewish history of a similar nature to the Holocaust. It is in fact one of the things that our generation can access the consciousness of, because we're not so far from the Holocaust, and therefore we can have some understanding of the effect of what I'm about to talk about on the Jews of Europe as a result of the First Crusade. So we have these two great big pushes from Christianity, one that way and one that way. Now, ostensibly, the project of the Crusades was, we like to think of it like that, because we put ourselves or our concerns at the center of everything. And it is true that one of the great banners of the Crusades was to retake Jerusalem and to return Jerusalem and in effect the whole of the Holy Land to Christian dominance. But that was like, remember what I said, if you conquer Jerusalem, you're not well until you conquer Jerusalem. So that was seen as the ultimate achievement. But the whole project was really to try and bring this whole part of the world officially under Christianity and kind of officially under the Byzantine rule. Obviously, Western Christendom wanted to pull the power strings, but they had to acknowledge that really this eastern part of Christianity was actually naturally of the province of the Byzantine Empire. But at that time, the Byzantine Empire was weak, and Western Christianity just saw itself as having a great big sphere of influence going all the way around here. But capturing the Holy Land and capturing Jerusalem was the ultimate aim, but there was a lot of stuff along the way. They wanted to capture all of the place names and cities that are mentioned in the Bible and in the New Testament. That includes Antioch, it includes all Edessa, it includes all of the different cities and towns along here, but principally the Holy Land. Bearing in mind, and I don't want to give you any spoilers, but so that you don't think this series is going to be about the Crusades, I'm going to tell you the ending. The ending is that it was a complete and total failure. Millions of lives and countless resources and awfulness and nastiness and violence for 200 years to achieve nothing. Because by the time you get to the 14th century, the Crusades are over and there's no Christian kingdom, there's no nothing. This is firmly in the hands of Islam. And of course, by the time you get to the 15th and the 16th centuries, the Ottoman Empire is there, and they hold the land of Israel right up until the 20th century. There is nothing gained by the Crusades other than misery. The Crusades, of course, were announced by Urban II, and the Crusaders, who were called Crusaders because why?
Cross.
They wore a big cross on their garments. And they were promised two things by Urban. They were promised spiritual dispensation. It is the exact Islamic equivalent, Christian equivalent of a jihad. They were promised spiritual dispensation. That is, all your sins will be remitted and you'll go straight into heaven. You won't have 70 virgins. You'll have, whatever's available, but you'll be getting into heaven. And the other thing is that whatever you conquer, whatever you find, whatever you take, you can keep. So there were these two. So you've got hundreds of thousands of people wandering around Europe going, that sounds like fun. Now, many, many years ago, I did read one historian, and I can't remember who it was. I wish I remembered in which book I'd read it, but it stuck in my mind that a couple of historians have made the observation that, and I'm just saying this as an aside, so we remember this, that the whole of the Middle Ages can only really be understood through a kind of drunken haze. You couldn't drink water. Nobody was drinking water. So the only thing that was safe to drink was beer. So when you woke up in the morning, you had beer. And in the middle of the day, you had beer. And at night, you had beer. And when you went up in the middle of the night to go to the toilet, you had a beer. You're not drinking water, you're drinking beer. So the whole of the Middle Ages is kind of like, just to bear that in mind. Now, Urban announced the First Crusade, which was, of course, led by... No. That's the third. And now we're going to do that next week. Godfrey of Bouillon. And they, of course, arrived in Jerusalem in 1099 and immediately proceeded to massacre all non-Christians. Jerusalem at the time was quite a centre of Jewish life. Jerusalem at various periods has gone through different types of renaissance and rebirth. It was a happening place, and I'll be discussing that in a moment as to an aspect of that. It was a happening place. We don't have exact population estimates, but people that were there tell us that it's probably something like 5,000 or 6,000 Jews died in that massacre, but they weren't the only ones. Muslims died as well. Jews, of course, after the conquest of Jerusalem and the establishment of the Latin Kingdom, Jews were not allowed to live in Jerusalem after 1100. So if we walk in 1100, we're already in time and place in the land of Israel, where Jews are not allowed to live in Jerusalem. There are some Jews populated throughout the land of Israel at this stage, which is now, it's been taken from the Fatimids and the Seljuks had been fighting over it the last few years, but it's now been taken, now it's Christian. And the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem is, over the next few years, is basically going to expand to be about the size of Israel today. But as tragic as that was, and as awful as that was, the massacres in Jerusalem, and there's an entire community that was herded into a synagogue, and the synagogue was set alight, and all the horribleness that was brought from Western Europe, that wasn't the biggest impact. The biggest impact, well, in terms of just sheer awfulness, it may have actually had an impact psychologically and spiritually, and we don't know what great figures' lives were ended in that massacre, but the events that happened in Europe as a result of Urban's call for a First Crusade are very, very difficult. I can tell you, as someone who's read a reasonable amount of Jewish history, is that you get used to reading about some periods of time and some events that are awful. In our own generation, as I said earlier, after the Shoah, we're so used to hearing horrendous things that maybe we've even become numb to it. But one of the reasons why the Rhineland massacres of the First Crusade are so powerful is because we're not dealing with numbers that defy understanding like the Shoah, millions or hundreds of thousands. But we're dealing with communities of, say, 1,000, 1,500 people, with all of the details about how these massacres went, and details about the things that were done and the efforts that were made to try and stop it and so on. These events that happened in 1095, 1096, in which tens of thousands of peasants rose up under phenomenal anti-Semites like Peter the Hermit and roved across the Rhineland landscape looking for Jews, because they basically said, we don't need like all these knights in fancy armour and their horses who are going off to the Holy Land. We got non-Christians right here. And haven't our priests been telling us that the Jews killed our Lord? So we have to find retribution for that. Now's the time. And surely, if I'm going to go to heaven for killing Muslims in the Holy Land, I'm certainly going to go to heaven for killing Jews here. Plus, I'm already 4 beers in this morning. The events have got different names. One of the names that it came down in Jewish history known as for generations after, the way that we talk about the Shoah, they talked about the Akedah. They theologically bound this up with the binding of Isaac. They saw it as a form of sacrifice. This was a time, remember that until this point, there hadn't really been any significant anti-Semitic massacres in Germany. Jews have been in Germany by this time for a while, in different and intermittent ways. We do have some established communities, but this suddenly came out of nowhere, and the Jews did not expect it, because the Jews had been promised, even when they saw the clouds on the horizon of this, that they would be protected because the bishops and the nobility did not want this to happen. Remember what we learnt. What did we learn in year 9 social studies? Everybody learnt this. What did we learn about? We learned about the feudal system. Yeah? And in the feudal system, it's a great big pyramid. And at the top sits the king and the noble families. And then you've got your different classes. Your soldier class, your war class, your merchant class, your artisans, your guilders, and so on. And then a whole lot of peasantry here. And then you had a kind of a parallel structure in the church, but these two were interrelated. And then you had your hierarchy of animals, you had your horse, your cow, your dog, your sheep, all the way down to the cockroach. And underneath the cockroach were the Jews. We were not even seen as autonomous beings. We were owned in Europe by the king. In most countries in Europe throughout the Middle Ages, Jews were the king's property. Now, because Jews were the king's property, the king could do what he liked with them, but the king also had to extend protection, as did the church. Don't think that everybody in the Christian church was awful. Many high-placed bishops were appalled at these massacres and went about trying to help protect Jews by bringing them into fortresses during the time of the Akedah. But it didn't help. Like those sci-fi movies where you see the aliens pouring over the walls, right? They literally did that. They climbed over the walls of forts in their thousands to kill Jews. One bishop actually witnessed 50 Jews taking their own life in his own house because they saw the hordes coming up the street. This was the first time really in the Middle Ages that we see the rise of a very unique Ashkenazi type of martyrdom. These people killed themselves, obviously, rather than accept forced conversion. But even in the case where that wasn't an option, it was clear these crowds were going to kill them regardless, not to submit to this kind of horror. It's a very big deal to take your own life in Judaism. So martyrdom under these circumstances that happened, thousands and thousands of Jews, hundreds of communities were wiped out. The big ones give it another name to these events, which is called Churban Shum. Churban Shum, the destruction of the three great communities of Germany, of Speyer, of Worms, and of Mainz. They were wiped out. Mainz, this is the place where a century earlier Rabbeinu Gershom had established his famous yeshiva, where Rashi had gone and studied. Wiped out. So it was a kind of a mini Shoah. And those who think that the German Shoah that happened in the 20th century is a unique experience, is an isolated experience, need to look again. Because the Jews of Germany have been attempted to be exterminated by the German population several times. And I'm not going to go on that hobby horse right now, but I need us to understand these were awful, these events. And they devastated communities. So what we've got here now is we've just had that. We've just had the Crusaders' victory in the Holy Land. Jews in Islamic countries are for the most part okay. There are occasionally rulers that get up that make life difficult, but we are protected by a dhimmi status. That unique status that non-Muslims who are people of the book, Jews or Christians, have within Islamic lands. We're allowed some degree of autonomy. We're allowed to lead unhassled and even comfortable lives, but we're not allowed to rise above a certain status within the Islamic world. Yep. All right, so I've said historical background. I now want to talk about some things, right? But this is the world we're in. Now you can wake up again. It's okay. We're good. one more historical backgrounding, but it's important. Well, no, we're not just on backgrounding, we're into a thing, but I need to show you this, because you need to understand. The other thing that's happening, that a lot of people who study Jewish history of this period do not always take into account, especially, I won't say the names of, some popular websites, but we need to understand this. There is a very, very influential movement inside the whole of the Jewish world that has been going for 200-300 years already, and whose influence is considerable and perhaps even expanding. Depending on who you read, and depending on what estimates we come up with, somewhere between 10 and 40%. But even if it was just 10%, that's huge. And might be more, somewhere between 10, 30, 40% of the Jewish world were Karaite. Very good. What's Karaite, David? People familiar with the Karaites? Put your hand up if you're not sure. Sorry, I was about to say very good, and a whole lot of people put up their hand because I could just move it. The Karaites believe in a fundamental, literal reading of the Torah. It's a movement that started in Babylonia, over here in Iraq, in the 8th century, but by now, in the beginning of the 12th century, and certainly, you have to realize that the Karaite movement during the 11th century, during the 1000s, underwent what the Karaites themselves call their golden age. Karaite scholars were prolific and brilliant, and Karaite communities were popping up all over the place. The way we can understand that is to look at it as Karaism as a kind of reform movement. It does actually have some measure of similarity in some ways with progressive Judaism of today. In some ways, but in others very much not. But it is a movement that comes from within the Jewish world that tries to change and reform things. But they were not trying to make it easier. In some ways, the Karaite movement were making Judaism harder by sticking to absolute literal interpretation. But they were extremely clever about it. And they weren't just interested in the Torah per se, they were developing all sorts of things like grammar and poetry and many, many, many sophisticated intellectual products. Now, the Karaite world was big in Jerusalem up until the First Crusade, where the Karaite community of Jerusalem was destroyed. They were big in Egypt, and they in the Fatimid dynasty, and they were big in Islamic Spain. In fact, the famous Karaite Sidi ibn al-Tarash, who went from Spain, he went to Jerusalem, he studied with the Karaite community, and after that community was destroyed, he made his way back to Spain and set up Karaism in Spain. And when he died, his wife, who we know as Al-Mu'allima, took over the whole of the Karaite movement in Spain as its religious leader and teacher. The Karaites had a big deal about the equality of women in leadership, religious and spiritual leadership. So what do we notice about that? What do we notice about that?
Were they affected as much as the other Jewish factions?
No, because they are living for the most, and this is really what I was about to say, is that what we notice about that is that those places are in the Islamic world. Karaism never really took off in Western Europe because Ashkenazic Jewry had some other things they had to think about and be concerned with. There was a far greater level of solidity in European Jewry. They couldn't afford these kinds of fractious and alternative and radical and reforming movements.
What do you mean they couldn't afford it?
They didn't have the luxury. They didn't have the Jews living in Islam were more or less left to their own devices. The Jews in Europe simply were they were struggling just to maintain some level of intellectual and spiritual discourse, which they did amazingly, but not of that kind of form. Most of the great rabbinic figures of this period are having to fight the Karaites. And for example, in the early parts of the 1100s, Alfonso VI, just to show you an example of how this world works, Alfonso VI is the king of Castile in the early 1100s. He took over from his father Ferdinand, who'd conquered Toledo and so on. He has a number of powerful Jews in his government. The Christian kings who took Spain took Spain helped by Jews. They didn't have the same kind of Germanic, Frankic, anti-Semitic build-up. And someone like Joseph Ferrezuel, who went on to become basically Alfonso's prime minister, organized through a whole range of things that the kings of Spain, the Christian kings of Spain, would expel all the Karaites. That's the extent to which Karaism was not going to be a part of the European Jewish picture. It was much more of an Islamic phenomenon, but nevertheless an important one for us to understand. And Joseph Ferrezuel himself is an important figure in that context, not only because he got Alfonso to kick out all the Karaites from Christian Spain, but because it shows that the early kings of Christian Spain didn't have a problem with Jews and had many Jews in their governmental machine. All right. Now, in the very first years of the 1100s in Jewish history, we see the passing of two enormous giants of Jewish scholarship and Torah scholarship that are going to shape Jewish literature and Jewish thought, and particularly Jewish practice. Two enormous giants of Torah scholarship who really comprise this picture. When we talk about Jewish Torah scholarship, this period that we're in the early 1100s, has a name. What is that name? It is the period of the Rishonim, who we call the first ones. The Rishonim are the great codifiers of Jewish literature and thought and law. They are all living in that period from around 1000 to 1500 is a period that we call the period of the Rishonim. Two of the greatest Rishonim have just passed away in the early 1100s. One in 1103 and one in 1105. Who am I talking about? Now I know some of you are sitting there going, "Oh, he's just telling me the names of more rabbis." But these, you can imagine in the time I've got, I can only mention people that are enormous. That this is not someone that when you talk to someone they're going to say, "Who's that? That's obscure." This is not obscure. These two are big. So who are they? And they both passed away within 2 years of each other. The first one I'll mention first because he's a bit older and he came first, and that of course is the Rif. Who is the Rif? I'm not standing here until someone tells me who the Rif is. Even if it has to be me. No, Rashi is not the Rif. No. Okay, looks like I'm going to be the one that has to tell me. This is it's not leaving this room. That you didn't know this.
I'm looking back on old notes.
You're looking back on old notes. I've never given this talk before, but anyway. But I have spoken about the Rif because even in the context where we look at 500 years in 1 hour, we have to talk about the Rif. In fact, I talk about the Rif even in the whole of Jewish history in 1 hour. That's how big the Rif is. Rif is Rav Yitzchak Alfazi because he lived in Fez, which is here. Although that's only 20 miles between there and there, but you get the idea. No, that's not there. Fez is over here, in Morocco. Rabbi Yitzchak Alfazi was a giant who realized that what this thing called the Talmud was absolutely, like the Geonim had already realized that the Talmud was a very, very unwieldy instrument if you're trying to find out exactly what you have to do. It doesn't have any guidelines for how to decide Jewish law out of its many, many discussions. The Talmud can discuss something for pages and pages, but doesn't actually tell you what you're supposed to do. It just gives you lots of stories and underlying principles behind it. But others have to come along and decide, well, that's all very good, but what, based on all these principles and based on this application and based on this circumstance, what is the law? What do we do? I've put a milking spoon in a fleshik cup. What do I have to do? I'm not going to write back to Babylonia and wait 3 months for the answer. Besides, there's no one left in Babylonia to tell me the answer. What, I'm going to go and learn the whole Talmud so I can find out how to make a cup of tea? So Rav Yitzchak Alfazi begins the project of drawing out from the Talmud its halachic decisions and creates in effect a version of the Talmud. That's what his book, the Halachot, is a much, much shorter version of the Talmud, only containing those parts which arrive at the final decision and extracting those parts from the discussion that are the final decision. That's a huge project. He based that project on an approach to learning that decided to simplify everything by just focusing, when you read an entire Talmudic passage, focusing simply on what's the outcome, what do I have to do? As opposed to poring over it with all sorts of intellectual and kind of casuistry to try and match this one up against that. Like, what's the principle here? Why doesn't that match what I read in the other part of the Talmud? Blah, 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 blah. How am I going to resolve this with my brilliant logic and my knowledge of the whole Talmud? And all of those different types of glosses and things that were going on. This is the great bifurcation in Jewish scholarship that happens right here between simplification, as embodied in the work of the Rif, and complication, as we're about to see, starts happening in Europe. Because the other great, of course, goes without saying, I have to mention, of course, that the Rif, apart from being this huge scholar, at the age of 75 was accused of a crime in Fez, falsely accused, but had to flee Morocco. So in the late 1080s, just before our period, he has turned up in Spain and opened the first Torah Academy, the first yeshiva in Spain, in Lucena, in the south of Spain. And that then is going to go on and train a whole new generation of scholars in the methodology of the Rif. It's a very cool name, the Rif. Kind of a shame he's taken it, but there you go, the Rif. Now, one of his greatest student, actually, who took over after the Yeshiva at Lucena, after the Rif passed away in 1103, and I'm only mentioning this person because they're important in our story, is Rabbi Yosef ibn Migash, big student of the Rif. The other great giant of the Torah scholarship world, with a very different approach and agenda, but a complete contemporary of the Rif, and they die within a couple of years of each other, is of course Rashi. So the Rif is here and Rashi is here. You see how this world of the Ashkenazic and the Sephardic world have already started to bifurcate? Rashi is not really ever concerned in his writings with halachic outcome. Rashi is concerned with what does this text mean? And my questions are on the text. Not just what does this text mean, but why is this text saying this when another text is telling me something else? Now, it's all very well for me to discard all that, but I've got to see the whole thing as a whole. So Rashi develops two foundational commentaries that are, of course, still studied today. And I say this, you have to be very proud of the Jewish world. If you go around the Christian world today, how many people are sitting right now at this moment studying medieval European text? Maybe in some seminaries they're looking at a bit of Aquinas and they're looking at a bit of this. How many Muslims today are studying Ibn Rushd and Al-Ghazali? Maybe in some higher level Islamic theological academies they are studying that material, and every time they go back and they look at hadiths, I'm sure they do. But you and I both know that right now, tens if not hundreds of thousands of people in the Jewish world are studying Rashi and are studying the Rambam. And a few are studying the Rif. Rashi wrote two great commentaries, one on the Torah and one on the Talmud. It is said that if not for Rashi's commentary on the Talmud, we would have lost the Talmud, because the chain of transmission of what it actually means would have been broken. The Talmud is very difficult to understand, and if you have to start from scratch without any commentating help, unless you're hearing it from someone that knows it, it's extremely difficult. Today we have translations and we have all those things didn't exist then. And before you work out what the halakha is, you have to know what the text means. And with the Torah, his commentary on the Torah, which is studied today, it's the most foundational commentary on the Torah, was designed to be read by children, but it is phenomenally deep. It's anything, but it's not a simplification. Rashi brings from Midrash, he brings from all sorts of sources, but he's focused on trying to explain the passage and fill in the missing gaps and to answer contradictions. Written very simply, but actually not much simple about Rashi's. Apart from it can be understood by a 5-year-old, but it's got many layers beneath it, above it. So these two passed away at the beginning of the 1100s. Now, Rashi, as you famously know, didn't have any single successor to his system. He himself didn't have any sons. He had daughters. This is a period that some of you are familiar with in Jewish history and in Europe in the early part of the 12th century, where the status of women was on the rise. That people did not see a conflict with the idea, whether we're talking about the Karaites in Spain or Jews, very traditional Jews living in northern France, didn't seem to have a problem with the idea that women could be spiritual leaders. Rashi did not have sons, so he taught Torah to his daughters. Now those daughters were great people in their own right. They introduced quite a number of different innovations into Jewish law from a feminine perspective. A lot of people don't actually realize that. They weren't just people you read about in a book and go, oh, those were learned women, that's nice. They actually made changes. The whole bracha for lighting candles for Shabbat comes from them. The whole idea about the way women are to be treated and to behave in Jewish communal life in its most ideal sense comes from then. It has since been corrupted. But that period, which is also of course commensurate with a slight rise in the status of women for a brief window in European life generally, which is another subject, but they married some of the great scholars of Europe, and their children, particularly his daughter Yocheved and her children. How many daughters did Rashi have? 3 that I'm aware of. And Yocheved married Meir ben Shmuel, and they had 4 sons who went on to become giants and who wrote commentaries on their father's their grandfather's commentary. Those two, of course, the Rashbam, Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir, and of course, our favorite, Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam. And Rabbeinu Tam is a very unique individual. These people are living in northern France and in Germany for most of the 1100s. And people like the Rashbam and Rabbeinu Tam go on to create this phenomenal, not only an uber commentary on their grandfather that became embedded itself in the Talmud, that worked towards ultimate, centuries away, ultimate halachic engagement, but created an entire method of pilpulic discussion that, interestingly enough, also reflected the kind of intellectual approach that was developing in Europe itself. And why is Rabbeinu Tam? Why must Mali when I say Rabbeinu Tam? What is it about Rabbeinu Tam? Who's heard of Rabbeinu Tam? Who's never heard of Rabbeinu Tam? Well, there you go. You see, that's why I stand here. But Rabbeinu Tam, Yaakov was his name. He's called the Tam, like it's perfect, the perfect one. And we call him Rabbeinu. Certain rabbis are so big that they get called Rabbeinu, our teacher. The interesting thing about Rabbeinu Tam is that many of his halachic suggestions are at complete variance with his grandfather. There are two famous applications of Rabbeinu Tam's halakha today, and it always seems to be that anyone that wants to show that they're got a bit of shtick, you know what I mean? Like I'm frommer than you, because I keep Rabbeinu Tam. One is particularly in the times of going out of Shabbat. Yeah? I mean, I'm sure most of us, when Shabbat goes out, we go outside, 3 stars, good, that's fine, I'm going to make Havdalah, right? But people who keep Rabbeinu Tam wait like an extra 40, 45 minutes, I keep Rabbeinu Tam. Occasionally you'll go to someone's place and you'll go, no, and they go, Rabbeinu Tam. The other famous dispute, of course, that Rabbeinu Tam had with his grandfather was over the tefillin. We know that Rashi's daughters were putting on tefillin, as were other women in Europe at the time. So it's very interesting that they argued over the tefillin. It's to do with the order of the scrolls inside the tefillin. Now people turn around and go, well, how is that? If everybody's talking about, this unbroken chain of transmission, how do you have a situation where there's one guy and his own grandson there arguing about what the tefillin is supposed to look like? Yeah? Mind-blowingly, and I'm not going there, I'm just telling you this because it's too interesting, but amazingly, a few years ago, near Qumran, in one of those archaeological finds, they found from the 2nd century CE a whole bunch of tefillin. So naturally, they wanted to see who was right between the Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam, based on this. These tefillin come from nearly 1,000 years before them. And amazingly, half the tefillin were like Rashi and half the tefillin were like Rabbeinu Tam. It's an incredible story, it's true. So, but at any rate, the Ba'alei Tosafot is an entire generation that's going to go on also for the next couple of 100 years as their descendants develop this entire way of looking at the Talmud, where they're not trying to extract the written law. I'll let others do that. We're going to dive right in and try and work out what these underlying principles and concepts have got to do with each other, and what these texts actually mean, and what words are supposed to be here that are not, and what words are here that are not supposed to be here. The whole textual engagement of that, and of course, in the footsteps of their grandfather and their ancestor, the whole approach of commentary. They basically invented what we understand as Jewish commentary. The Middle Ages and this period is going to bubble up with many, many amazing commentators amongst the Rishonim. Now, they are the great students of Rashi. Yosef ibn Migash also had 2 great students who emerged from Spain during the first half of the 1100s. Just watching the time, I need to make sure that we stay on track. We have a little bit to talk about. And it's impossible not to talk about this figure because he is flourishing and dominant in the early 1100s. one of two of the many amazing figures that came out of Spain. But if we had to pick two, it would be these two that come out of Spain from the whole Rif Yosef ibn Migash school of southern Spain in the early 1100s. One is Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. Now I know you've heard of Yehuda Halevi. Because it's a street in Tel Aviv. Definitely. That is how most people encounter him for the first time. But in fact it's a street in Tel Aviv because he was a remarkable individual in Jewish history. The first thing that we need to know about Yehuda Halevi, if we've only got a minute to speak about him, which we have, and it's completely inadequate to talk about a person like this in a minute, but if we had to talk about him for a minute, we would realize that in an age, not just a generation, but in an age of the Jewish people's most profound and amazing poets, he is the greatest. He is the greatest poet. It's a bit like saying, the Renaissance and early modern period of English poetry produced some great figures, but Shakespeare. Yehuda Halevi is really phenomenal. And Yehuda Halevi, and he wrote about everything. He didn't just write about religious topics. He wrote about love, and he wrote about life, and he wrote eulogies for people. They're all writing on all sorts of different topics. But to understand Yehuda Halevi's soul is really to understand that here is a poet that is reacting to the time in which he lived. That whole concept of the Crusades and the Reconquista is tearing his homeland apart, and he realizes the insecurity of the Jewish communities of Spain even as early as then. And his famous words, Ani b'ma'arav, I am in the west, v'libi b'mizrach, and my heart is in the east, really kindle that yearning of Jewish communities to return to Zion, to return to our own place, our own homeland. It's not an easy level of consciousness for us right now in Caulfield. It's not. No one's busting a gut sitting here going, oh, I wish I could go back to Israel. Because if you want to go to Israel now, you get on a plane and you go. But most people stay where they're comfortable. Well, for Yehuda Halevi, it wasn't comfortable. And of course, towards the end of his life, he takes that great pilgrimage. Actually, probably more that way, because we know he was in Egypt. He takes that great pilgrimage to the land of Israel. The other thing that we would know about Yehuda Halevi, which is phenomenally influential and also emblematic of this period, is of course his authorship of the book,
The Kuzuri.
The Kuzuri. You're familiar with the Kuzuri, so I don't need to spend too much time on it. The Kuzuri is one of the great works of thought to emerge from the whole of the Middle Ages. The Kuzuri, of course, is based fictionally on the famous nation of the Kazars that for 300 years before had been running around here. They were a nominally Jewish nation. There's a lot of historical discussion and debate about the exact historical reality of the Kazars, but I'm happy to presume there was such an entity. They had ties with the Gaonim in Babylonia and so on, but by the time Yehuda Halevi came along, and they had written to Jewish leaders in Spain, but by the time Yehuda Halevi came along, they were more or less done. But Yehuda Halevi romantically projected this book that he wrote into the initial discussions that the king of the Kazars had with a Christian priest, an Islamic cleric, a philosopher, and a Jew. And so he sets up that whole paradigm by which he can discuss the truths of Judaism. Basically, he deals with and demolishes all the other religions and philosophies in about the first 5 or 6 pages, And the rest of the book is just on Judaism. Because that, of course, is what the king wants to hear about, because he ultimately converts to Judaism. And Yehuda Halevi does not see it as his job to outline the principles of other religions. He's interested in Judaism. But his expression and understanding of thought is phenomenal. He's not Kabbalah and he's not philosophy. He's something else. Something else about understanding the destiny of the Jewish people in the world. And he sees the Jewish people as a conduit for prophecy. As the conduit for prophecy to the world. And that we are the ones that are able to access this notion of the kavod, the glory which intermediates with the revelation of God and humanity. And as part of that, we need our own role within history, we need our own place. These are very big ideas that are going to be very, very influential on later thinkers, whether it's the Maharal of Prague or Rav Kook. Yehuda Halevi's Kuzuri has never ever been uninfluential in Jewish life.
Which king converted?
Abulan, the king of the Kazars, in the 8th century, according to the legend. Yehuda Halevi, I don't think, calls him Bulan. Bulan is his historical name. He just calls him the king of the Kazars. The other great student that emerges from the school of Yosef ibn Migash is not yet. In a few minutes, but we're not doing the Rambam tonight. Believe me, we can't just. We're not doing the Rambam. We're just doing the childhood of the Rambam tonight. But no. Is some of you may have heard of it. It's a bit slightly more obscure. But some of you will have heard of this. It is, and if we have to talk about one fascinating figure of Avraham ibn Ezra. And the first and foremost thing we need to understand about Avraham ibn Ezra is that he was a poet. And he was a darn good poet as well. Maybe not on the level of Yehuda Halevi, but he made a living as a poet. He was good enough to be a professional poet. What's fascinating about him is just how many different intellectual discourses and sciences he stuck his head into. He's known in the Christian and Islamic world, particularly in the Christian world, and in the non-Jewish world, predominantly as one of the foundational writers on astrology. But he also dabbled in astronomy, and he particularly dabbled in grammar, Hebrew and Arabic grammar, and most significantly, he wrote a phenomenal commentary on the Torah, which today sits in standard commentaries, Rashi and Ibn Ezra. And Ibn Ezra has a totally different approach to Rashi, because Ibn Ezra is not interested in what anything says except the words on the page and the language that it is said in. So he's not pulling from Midrash to explain things like Rashi is. He's answering things primarily linguistically. This was a turn, an intellectual turn within Judaism at the time. Even hundreds of years later, Spinoza was reading Ibn Ezra and going, oh, that's amazing. No, it doesn't make him a Karaite. It makes him potentially an Epicurus. Although he never really got that label, but later scholars, the Chazar of the Wissenschaft in the 19th century, they're all going, Ibn Ezra! Because he's the first person to allude to the fact that maybe not all of the Torah was written by Moses. But that is very subtle. Ibn Ezra is, of course, normative, and he is regarded as one of the great Rishonim. I understand your question as to why it doesn't make him a Karaite, but there are aspects of his learning and aspects of his commentary that could be read like that. That's a very interesting observation, but he's definitely not. He is deep within the rabbinic tradition. He's important to know about. All right. Now, what does it mean? What all this is going on in Spain, and okay, so we've got the Baalei Tosafot and so on going on here, but what? They don't sound very interesting, right? Why is that? Why is that? When Ibn Ezra leaves Spain and he wanders everywhere. He goes from town to town writing poems and also answering questions, writing commentaries. He got as far as Baghdad. He went to Israel. He's all over. Ibn Ezra is all over. And in Spain, and when he was in France, they brought him the poems that were written by the Baalei Tosafot. Because people weren't really writing poems in France and Germany, except liturgical poems. You know, some of the great piyutim, the liturgical poems that we say in the prayer services, were written in Germany and France during the Middle Ages, but not nice, real, fluid poetry. And they brought him the poetry of Rabbeinu Tam, and he was singularly impressed. And he is recorded. It's a statement of his. What's a Frenchman doing in the temple of poetry? Was versteht das Paradim von Polish Geschichte? Paradim were so into themselves that they were astonished that anyone in France or Germany was writing any decent poetry at all. But that's an interesting facet. Now, there is at this time, I know I've only got a few minutes left, but I just want to talk about a couple more things because I want to complete this, because otherwise next week we'll have to do them, and I need to be able to sort this out now. There is there's two, and those of you who attended my Glen Ira series the last few weeks would be familiar with what I'm about to say in the next couple of minutes, and that is that here in this part of the world there are developing two unique Jewish intellectual projects. Most of this talk is background tonight, but we have to talk about this. One is the rise of Jewish philosophy in the form of Aristotelianism. Now, Jewish philosophy didn't start here. It really gets kicking 100, 150 years earlier with Sa'ad Gaon over here, responding to all sorts of philosophical accusations of the Kalam and so on. But here, like the rest of Europe, they're starting to get very involved in this shift from Platonic philosophy to Aristotelian philosophy, which is much more logical and rational, and really is about to be the grounding of what's going to become Western science. And you need to realize that in the Middle Ages, Aristotle was the science of its day. That was science. And so how do we ameliorate the findings of Aristotle with Torah? Torah is based on revelation. To what extent can we use the rational mind to work out things about the world? And what happens if it appears to us that the rational mind, based on what Aristotle is telling us, is in fact in conflict with the Torah? Now, these questions have never gone away, have they? Really? But every generation has to answer it for itself. And at that time, the big science was Aristotle. We're not bothered by Aristotle's questions anymore. We got other things. We got Hawking and this. But now, so people had to sit there. So Aristotelian philosophy started to become read by Jews, and some Jews were very impressed by it, and they were able to make these great big syntheses. The first of those great big syntheses is happening in Spain in the first part of the 1100s by a guy called Avraham ibn Daud. Avraham ibn Daud, who we would know a lot more about if he hadn't been born 25 years before the Rambam. But Avraham ibn Daud sees philosophy, Aristotelian philosophy, as simply something that is evolving into Judaism. Judaism is the pure revelation of rational truth. It's a revelation, but it's also pure rationality from God's point of view. It's God's rationality revealed in the world. And so the more that we can understand how the Torah is based on rational principles and how Judaism sits as a rational part of the logical universe, the closer we are to perfection. These are amazing ideas. These are amazing ideas. They are turning Judaism into a science. And the other big idea that's coming into the world, just now getting its genesis, is here. Near where Spain meets France. The very southeast of France, in a place called Provence. The whole movement of the Chachmei Provence. Kind of the closest part of the Ashkenazic world to the world of Sfarad. And they are dabbling in a whole different variety of philosophical speculation. that is much more Neoplatonic and much more Gnostic, and I wish we had more time and to go into those in detail. And in that series I gave in Glenara, especially last week, the talk on Kabbalah, I went into that in detail. The Chachmei Provence are speculating, and they are the ones really that innovate or channel or receive or transmit, whichever way you want to look at it, the whole idea that Kabbalah is based on of the Sfirot and the creative modalities of the divine, by which the divine interacts with the world, and that place the Jewish people and humanity as part of that project of emanation. They are then going on to create the first of the great Kabbalistic texts, already 150 years before the Zohar, called the Book Bahir. So the Chachmei Provence are extremely important. Their influence in the immediate sense is going to go directly into Spain rather than back north. Because back up here, things are just going to get, there's one horribleness after another.
So
Sorry.
You're saying that in France there was far less murder.
No. I'm saying that these guys were in southern France, southeastern France. So in a sense they were away from that, but their influence went into Spain rather than back north to the rest of France and Germany. Because in France and Germany it was just too awful, things were happening all the time. And in Spain, with this struggle between Christianity and Islam, was much more receptive to those ideas. 1144, right at the end of the period that I'm talking about tonight, and I know that I've only got a minute and I've already gone over to an extent, but this is very important. 1144, there's a new thing in the world. What is it? Norwich, 1144, is the first, in England, is the first blood libel. They found a child that had been stabbed. They found the corpse of a Christian child, and the Jews were accused of ritual murder. That was the first recorded instance of a blood libel. It caused a lot of suffering to the Jews of England, but it spread. So within a few short decades, blood libels against Jewish communities were popping up all over here. As I often say, once an anti-Semitic idea starts somewhere, it soon becomes very trendy. And they're all popping, I've got a blood libel here, a blood libel there. And the accusation was that every year before Pesach, the leading Jews in the world gather at some secret place and decide which part of the world that year is the part that they will go and they will get their ritual sacrificial child. And that year, 1144, they said that happened to be England, and the Jewish community of Norwich was charged with the responsibility of finding a Christian child and stabbing it and getting its blood, and that blood would then be given out to Jewish communities all over the Jewish world for use in their matzahs. This is an accusation that is beyond understanding. And it didn't occur, well, it's not some mad, bipolar nut just deciding one day to have this accusation. This is popping up all over the place, even right up until today. Right to the 20th century. Even though at various times, even both the Islamic and Christian leaders at various times have come out and said, this is ridiculous, it still seems to pop up. Now,
It must be based on a pagan sort of...
there is a precedent for it in the ancient world, and even precedent for it against Jewish communities, but it's kind of got its own medieval European Christian anti-Semitic flavour that theologized it to Christianity. Because they claim that we misread the New Testament. So instead of wanting the blood of Christ, we want the blood of a Christian. They're ridiculous. What's not ridiculous about this whole period? But except it's tragic. And then in 1145, what I'm about to say? No, I thought you were about to say the what? No, that's coming. In 1145, the Christian Church announced a second crusade. More massacres. It wasn't just the first crusade. The second crusade also saw more massacres. What was happening is the Islamic world was making incursions on the Latin kingdom, a Christian kingdom, so they decided, let's have another crusade. We only had one 50 years ago, let's have another one. It's a bit like the two world wars, you know, there's something about the Germans. They don't understand the first time. So they say, we'll go again. And they get schmeiced. The Islamic world knows they're coming, and it's not like the first time, right? They don't lose the kingdom at that point, but the guys coming over here don't really achieve very much. And this is still a shrunken Latin kingdom. And they lost Edessa up here, and they lost a number of other counties that had been taken in the great push of the First Crusade. So it's still there, but it's less. However, at the time of the Second Crusade, there were some awful massacres. Following the Blood Libels, following the Second Crusade, guys like Randolph, this random French priest that started running around the countryside with thousands of people specifically saying, we have to kill Jews. God's punishing us because we haven't killed all the Jews of Europe. Massacring communities. All the great bishops of Europe telling the man to stop. Bernard of Clairvaux, the famous French cleric, came out and tried to stop him. They couldn't stop him, and eventually they got hold of him and sent him back to a monastery, but not before he had done untold damage to dozens of communities. So some of these, every time you hear a crusade, there's nastiness. However, I'm just going to, this is the last thing, because in 1135, in Spain, in the middle of all this picture, 1135, his father is the judge of Cordova, is the Dayan of Cordova, and a direct student of Yosef ibn Migash. So Maimon had been a student of Ibn Migash together with Ibn Ezra, together with Yehuda Halevi, and he became the Dayan, the chief rabbinic judge of Cordova, which was still in southern Spain, still very safe. And they had a number of children, a number of sons, and this remarkable boy, Moshe ben Maimon. Now, we're not talking about the Rambam tonight specifically, but his childhood. He was born in Cordova. The Rambam writes in a letter later on in life that he, at the age of 6, he ran away from home. He wasn't a completely good boy. But where did he run? He didn't run to the circus or the beach. He ran to this house of study of Yosef ibn Migash and plonked himself there as a 6-year-old wanting to be one of his disciples and students. Obviously he got sent home, but they were all very impressed by the time they did that. He already impressed them even at the age of 6 and being the Rambam. But he grew up, and in the year of his bar mitzvah, everything that all the Jews had known about the golden age of Spain for the last 200 years came crashing down. Because it was one thing, the Christian conquests in the north, the Christians actually looked to the Jews for help because they figured they would need it. So the Jews finding themselves in these early Christian Spanish kingdoms were okay. And in the southern kingdom, of course, it had always been okay. But that all happened, that all changed when the Almohads, a new Talibanic ISIS-like movement, who were even more uncomfortable than the Almoravids, who themselves were more uncomfortable than the Moors, than the Umayyads, the Almohads swept through and took over everything and caused many, many thousands of Jewish families, particularly prominent ones, to flee. And that is why the Rambam's family, the family just picked up from Cordova and they ran, and the first place they ran was north, but they were just a bit too prominent even for that, and eventually made their way eastward, and the Rambam is going to end up in Egypt. But to understand the world in which the Rambam is born, this course is called From the Rambam to the Zohar, so to understand the world in which the Rambam is born was the aim of tonight's talk, and thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening. To find out more about David Solomon's books, recordings and classes, or to support his work and teachings for just a few dollars a month, visit davidsolomon.online.